good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're coming from. We have a truly global event here that I'm quite excited about. My name is Tim Lougheed. I am the Executive Director of the World Federation of Science Journalists. And it's our pleasure today to be working with the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, as well as the Young Researchers of Norway, to celebrate the winner and runners-up of the Letten Prize for 2021. We have this year's winner here to be interviewed, which of course is why you're here. But to get this ball rolling, I would like first to introduce Professor Heidi Holmen, who chaired the Letten Committee, to say a few words about the Letten Foundation and the prize itself. Professor Holmen, if you please.
Thank you, Tim. Dear all, and particularly dear Meta. As mentioned, I have acted as the Letten Prize Committee Chair as a member of the Young Academy of Norway. So first, a few words about the Letten Prize, which is awarded based on a partnership between the Letten Foundation and the Young Academy of Norway. So since Professor Letten Saugstad, which was born in 1925, died in 2014, she founded the Letten Foundation in 1986. And the foundation has funded research in Norway and abroad, and in 2018, it awards also young rights scholars through the Letten Prize, which is why we are here today. So the Letten Prize aims to recognize young scholars and their efforts in solving the global crisis and challenges of our time. So with me in the committee this year, I had 6 other brilliant young scholars from around the world, appointed after suggestions made by the Global Young Academy. So throughout the spring, we have had an inspiring yet challenging task to assess and discuss the applicants. The level was sky high and the competition was hard, but the level of expertise in the committee allowed fruitful discussions up until the end. And the result is, as known, a brilliant winner in Meta, which is here today, and the 2 runners-up, which is also announced, in Ramona Villarasa and Tolu Oni. Meta is the most deserving winner of the 2021 Letten Prize. So in line with the Letten vision, she aims to solve the malaria vaccine crisis, allowing young and particularly female researchers to partake. And she aims to share the endeavors globally for increased outreach, most innovatively. So her plan is bold, yet possible to accomplish, and we look very much forward to hear more, both today and in the future, from this project. So, dear Meta, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Heidi.
That was what I prepared. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Holmen. A quick correction to what I said earlier. The Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters is in fact a partner with us, but today's activity is being supported by the Letten Foundation and the Young Academy of Norway. So I want to make sure everybody gets their fair due. Having said that, I'd like to hand over the proceedings to my good friend Thiago Medaglia in Brazil, who will be conducting the interview with Meta. Thiago, please introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Just a quick improvisation. I just want to mention that last month we lost in Brazil a brilliant science journalist, Mauricio Tufani. I just want to pay my tribute to him. He was a pioneer in covering the deforestation of the Amazon. So I really wanted to mention his name today. First of all, Meta, congratulations. This is a fantastic achievement and your work is brilliant. I'm eager to hear more about it. But before we move on, I just want to invite Professor Pancras Hogendoorn to say a few words about yourself, Meta. Please, Professor, go ahead. Introduce yourself, and then you can speak about Meta, please.
Thank you very much. So my name is a terrible Dutch name, is Pancras Hogendoorn. When you can pronounce that, you will be the champion. So despite that, I was a while ago elected as a dean of the Leiden University Medical Center, the center where Meta works. And I'm extremely proud of being able to speak a little bit about Meta, which is a very unusual thing. I just spoke to her last week when she was inaugurated as a full professor in Leiden, and now within 1 week, I have to share my thoughts again about you, Meta, which is shows how important you are for Leiden. Meta is a keen clinician scientist, and that's what I think the world needs. And when I want to introduce her, we have to say that she started originally in Maastricht, which is a university city in the south of the Netherlands. Then she went east to Nijmegen to end in the west in the Netherlands. And those of you who have ever been in the Netherlands, it's a very small country, but we still consider these three cities different to each other. And we, of course, are very happy that you work with us in Leiden in infectious diseases, and not only the infectious diseases of today in the Western world, which of course has been much of a focus of the world in last year, but also I'm afraid the coming months still, because we are only having achieved some goals in the Western part of the world, but not in other parts of the world where neglected diseases are present, and neglected is there also the COVID pandemic, when you see people suffering there. So your work as a clinician scientist in infectious diseases have been very instrumental in trying to cure disease, not only by treating patients, but also to do experiments with healthy volunteers in order to bring out a vaccine for very, very common diseases, very, very common in other parts of the world than the Netherlands. And that comes to your, let's say, your social heart, that disease. As a doctor, you should try to cure irrespective of the background of the person who is suffering. And that comes very close, at least to my heart, but also of Leiden University Medical Center, because we are there in the end to cure diseases regardless where people are coming from. And as you very elegantly alluded to in your inaugural speech, the amount of money which is going to Western medicine as opposed to medicine of the Southern Hemisphere. So having said that, you have been able to work here in Leiden with parasitologists, infectious diseases doctors, cell biologists, molecular imaging people, and that's because you were able to attract all these different people to your problem. That your problem is to cure these infectious diseases, and you've been very successful to that, in our view, but also in view of the jury of the Letten Prize. And let me end by saying that you have a very, very proud dean here of the Leiden University Medical Center, and I congratulate you very much on behalf of our staff and the board of directors. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Go ahead, Meta, please. You can...
I just want to say thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, it's touching. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a beautiful introduction. I see a lot of hands already, and that's good, because I wanted to mention that you that you can raise your hands, you can ask questions, you can use the chat. But of course, if you raise your hand, I can we can call you to. Since we are such a small group here, we can ask questions directly. I only ask you to be brief when asking questions, but I have the privilege to start asking, if you don't mind, and I'm going to take advantage of it. So, Meta, coming from Brazil, from a country where we do face poverty, and dealing with poverty-related diseases is such an important part of your work that really touched my heart. And I think that the one question that I really would like to start with is why we still don't have vaccines for diseases like malaria and others. What are the reasons? Of course, there are differences between a disease caused by a virus like COVID, but poverty is a similarity that we can see that is a key issue in the spread of this kind of diseases in general. So why did we have such a fast pace for COVID-19 vaccines and we have such a delay in other scenarios? Can you explain the scenarios for us, please?
Of course, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a really important and key question, but it's also a difficult one because I think there are multiple reasons why there are so many differences. And I think one of the first thing to start with is to realize that poverty and infectious diseases are very intertwined. So there's a lot of infectious diseases that are enhanced and transmission is enhanced in poor areas. And for COVID-19, everybody understands if you live close together in a very tight space or in squatters, that will enhance transmission. But for other diseases, parasites, for example, the lack of hygiene will also enhance transmission, or the lack of safe water will enhance transmission. So poverty and infectious diseases are very intertwined, which doesn't mean that if poverty goes away, all infectious diseases will go away. No, we'll still have infectious diseases. The main issue, the main problem that we face, and because they're very intertwined, is that if certain infectious diseases are very associated with poor areas and with low and middle income countries, that the market potential for a certain new medicine or a certain vaccine is very small as well. So that means that generally from an investor perspective, there will be very little incentive to actually invest into these infectious diseases. So whereas for COVID, we have hundreds of vaccines in preclinical, clinical development now, we have multiple vaccines being developed. One of the reasons is that companies are trying to beat each other to the race to be the first one, simply because there's a nice prize to be won at the end, which is not the case for example, malaria. And it gets even worse if you talk about neglected tropical diseases like schistosomiasis and hookworm, simply because the market is so poor, we have very little incentive, which means that for these areas, we really depend on public money and public funding. And then we obviously depend on society prioritizing these kind of infections. And so I want to immediately turn it around to a positive note instead of complaining about money, because I don't think that's really very effective. It also means that if we as a society decide to prioritize this, there is a way to actually generate more investment and to make sure that we do more research in that area. It's not just money. It's also because organisms like malaria, which is a protozoan, or schistosomiasis hookworm, even more complex and multicellular organisms, are much more complex. They have many more proteins that could potentially be vaccines. They've co-evolved for thousands, millions of years together with their host, instead of virus, which goes from one host to the other and isn't that adapted yet. It has ways to manipulate the host. And if you want to design a vaccine, for example, you have to realize or understand how the parasite does this for us to be able to overcome that. So the complexity of the research is also much bigger. So we need to actually invest much more to get to the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. And one interesting aspect of your reply is this kind of call to action, to call people to be part of it, to really care about that kind of disease that is related to poverty. And again, coming from Brazil, I can really relate with that, because I mean, I've been in the Amazon region many times as a reporter, and it never enter my mind how the place with such a huge amount of water, of fresh water, the one place in the planet with a lot of water, still people don't have access to clean water to drink. And that's directly related to diseases, as you just explained it. So my question, like a follow-up question, you've been in a lot of places working with poor populations and developing the work that you do and bringing that back to the lab and stuff like that. So what do you bring in your baggage after you come from a trip like that? Other than scientific data and analysis, what else does Meta brings when she comes back from a trip?
Oh, these trips are always extremely energizing because it makes me realize how much people are the same wherever you go. Wherever I go, on whatever trip I have, I'll always meet wonderful, inspiring people, and you always find common ground, things that are the same that you discover, common goals, and that really inspires me, and also I think reinforces my belief that we're part of a global community, and I strongly feel part of that community, and I think the Letten Prize, and particularly Letten Prize Committee, being these young members from these science academies, that's really the population, the type of people who understand how much we're interconnected, and how we're part of a global community, and connections are much easier now and faster, and we're all on social media, and getting this award from them, it means so much more, simply because they really understand and apparently appreciate and believe the same, in the same future. So that's extremely inspiring for me.
That's a beautiful answer, and I think that you touch it such a beautiful and important aspect, which is the sense of community, right? So I'm sure this is important. I know this is important to you because we discussed it before, and I know that you want to emphasize all the effort behind the award that you are receiving here. So I want to give you the room to do that. So, but also to emphasize this, to highlight what you just mentioned, the sense of community. A question, I want to also ask a question about this because I think it is important. Do you think, when we have a situation like COVID-19 happening now, and we see all the effort from scientists all around the world working in order to find solutions for people's health, and you see also scientists and science getting attacked by disinformation campaigns and stuff like that. So do you feel like we as a science community or scientific community, including science journalists on this, what do you think we can do to inspire this sense of community and inspire that into the society in general? Do you think that could be a positive effect of the pandemic? So it's kind of two-folded question, right? I know that you want to congratulate other people as well.
Yes. So I fully agree. So I think the COVID pandemic has made us realize how much we're part of a global community, and we can't see ourselves as being an isolated country. We are also a victim of what's happening worldwide. And it's interesting because you're asking me for a sense of community, and I think there we can learn a lot from LMICs, and particularly if you talk about the Amazon region. I've never been to the Amazon, but I can completely imagine there's small communities living there, and these are very interconnected, and these are very tightly connected and have a very good social structure. And if I went to, so I've often visited community health projects, where actually they'll have village health workers located at different villages, and being able to educate people and talk to people. And in a way, we can learn a lot from that kind of structure, which is a bit different, obviously, from our social media oriented communication channels, which apparently leads to disinformation, disbelief, and I think these social structures are extremely important, and we can learn from that. And so what I wanted to highlight, and I think it's great you're giving me the floor to do so, is that what I'm trying to do also with my team, not just the team that's here, but we have members around the world, to give them that same sense of connection and of community, of being part of the team, because it's really, I know it's a personal prize, and I'm extremely grateful, but the work obviously is being done by a lot more people. And these are often very young, ambitious people who are going to be hopefully the leaders of the future. And I think we have to realize, I have to give them the credit. And it's them, they create this community and the sense of a team, and they will actually advance science.
Fantastic. I have several very serious questions here that I want to ask, but I want to break the ice a little bit and also invite everyone else to raise your hands and ask questions. This is definitely an opportunity to interact as a group. But there's one question that I'm really curious about is when you are traveling to a tropical country and a mosquito bites you, what goes on your mind? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, so I have a strange mind, I have to say. Wherever I go, I will see diseases. Wherever I see a mosquito, I'll see diseases. It's not just when I travel, it's here as well. So I guess I have a bit of a distorted mind. But my personality, I'm very adventurous. So I'm not really scared of a lot of things. So if I see a mosquito, that really doesn't scare me. It just makes me realize, oh, I have to realize this is an area. And I look around and I see the children playing and I'm realizing, oh, this is, there's work to do here. Because this means that there might be diseases and we need to work to try and protect the children that live here. So it doesn't really affect me personally because, yeah, I'm an adventurous person. I like to travel. I don't, what will happen will happen.
Yeah, I think that's how we in tropical countries face mosquitoes. But I know my friends in other parts of the country are usually terrified about mosquitoes, and they ask us all the time. So what do you do? We say we live, we take care of our business, and move on. I know it's not exactly your field, but you are a virologist, and I have to ask you this: what do you think is the most plausible explanation for the origin of SARS CoV-2?
Okay. So this is a very difficult question. And obviously, that's really out of my area of expertise. But I think I share with you that sense of, some things happen. Like, when you live in LMIC, people get malaria. And there's very much a culture of, bad things sometimes happen without there being a reason. And so personally, this is also my view to SARS CoV-2. I think, viruses mutate. They can go from one host to the other. And sometimes there's a very unfortunate event. And such is life. I mean, we are subjected to bigger forces, and infectious diseases is something that will, be part of our lives wherever we live, always. And it's interesting. It fascinates me. There's a lot to learn.
Definitely, it is a fascinating field. One topic that it's always unclear to me as a science journalist is people talk very often about the relationship between let's say deforestation or damaging natural landscapes, and they spread and the spillover, possible new spillovers. But that's never very clear to me. It seems that we have sometimes, often in the media, I hate speaking about the media as a large group, but very often we see articles that kind of makes a direct relationship between those things. And can you explain to us a little better, like with some more clarity, where is the danger really? And because, I mean, we've been damaging nature for such a long time. And that was like deforestation was not the cause for the spillover regarding SARS CoV-2. Of course, I'm not defending deforestation. I work, my whole life is to work against that. But can you bring some clarity to this topic, do you think?
Yeah, so I think what we have to realize is that we're part of a bigger ecosystem, and infectious diseases are part of that. And if we make changes to that ecosystem, like deforestation, that will lead to changes, for example, in mosquito populations. That is inevitable. And with these changes, we usually increase the risk of certain infectious diseases. Ultimately, we can also decrease. I mean, if we in the Netherlands, we had a lot of swamps. Those were dried in a couple of decades ago, and with that, there were a lot of mosquitoes that also vanished, and that ultimately led to malaria control with help of pesticides. But obviously, you can't dry the whole world. So I think it's about, so if you look into the future and to my generation, it's up to us, scientists like me, not necessarily my specialty, but also ecologists, to think about how can we live together with this whole system and still have a full ecosystem, protect our biodiversity, which I think we also need as humans, and still foster health. And I think that requires bright, bold, novel ideas, I think.
That's very good. Thank you so much. Like a follow-up question on this, do you think there's a possibility that this is the first of a series of spillovers? Do you think that's plausible, or it's more a scenario of a terror movie or something like that?
I think infectious diseases will be there for the next couple of decades. So it can happen again, and the chances are luckily small, but the chances haven't changed now that it's happened, right? Statistically, that doesn't make any sense. So the chances of it happening was as big as it was 3 years ago. And it will stay that big unless we are willing to live differently, and to think about how we can live, in an ecological way, preventing, environmentally friendly, animal friendly, but still preventing spillover. But that's gonna require radical changes.
Right. Going back to speaking more about research, you are a researcher in the medical area, right? And I don't know, I know that happened in other countries as well, but in Brazil it was very, very strong. The recommendation of medication to people that are ineffective and that can even cause them damage. And that also coming from physicians, from doctors who are not scientists, but they are professional doctors. How do a medical researcher sees the medical community in that sense? Does the medical community needs to improve their relationship with scientific research? Do they need to go deeper on this in a general sense? Do you have a general view about this?
Yes, so I can completely understand. So particularly the COVID-19 situation, if you're a physician, I'm a physician as well. If you're a physician, you're treating a patient and you basically have nothing. You are empty-handed and you can see a patient deteriorate. That will lead to irrational decisions. And that makes sense because we're all emotional beings, and none of us became a physician to do nothing. We became physicians because we want to cure people, we want to help people. Nevertheless, I think that if we want to progress, we need to join forces, scientists and physicians, understand what are the critical questions that need to be answered, and get our evidence as soon as possible to generate these tools so that we can give the tools back to physicians. And it's a matter of standing together, putting time and effort into building those bridges between different people so that we understand each other, and we can go back and forth. So questions can go from the clinical part to the scientists, and scientists can give answers back. But usually, and we understand what we're talking about. What are the answers? What kind of answers? What population? What kind of patients? How do we treat them? These kind of answers we can discuss with each other. And I think one of the main advantages of the COVID-19 crisis, and I've seen this in our hospital as well, is that it really required a lot of building bridges, a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration which didn't used to be there because things didn't need to go necessarily that fast. But now, because the need was so big, we needed to move fast from clinic to research. Data from research need to go back to the clinic, and we really tried to speed up things. So I think that's been a main learning point.
And that's a cue for a follow-up question. We already have some questions on the chat, but I have to ask you this. Before I move on, I want to kindly ask people who are not speaking to turn on the mute button in the left bottom of your computer. The accent appears. Meta, I want to ask you this. You just spoke about science production in a way during the pandemic, right? What do you think that has changed already? Is anything going to change in the way we do science after the pandemic? And what is that?
Yes. So I think it's very obvious that things have already changed. And of course, I'm an optimist, but I'll give you a very key example. Publication of papers on repositories is something that used to not really been done a lot. During the crisis, I think everybody put the papers out on repositories immediately. So the sense of we need to share as quickly as possible has really increased. And of course, I think we can go a step further because I think the future will be in open science. I think the future will have to be in immediate sharing, data sharing, open data. So being able to see other people's data, being able to reuse data. And I think the COVID crisis has learned us to already take a lot of steps very quickly that had been prepared before because the repositories were there. They just were used very little. And now it's very common to do that. I think journals have become very accustomed to papers already being published on some kind of repository. And we are getting used to reading papers that haven't been reviewed yet, for example, which is different from reading a reviewed paper. And you have to obviously also be a bit cautious there. But I think that's one very, example of how things have already moved forward. But there's also a lot of steps that still need to be taken, I think.
That's amazing. And that affects directly our community of science journalists, because we need to be better prepared in order to communicate science because things are changing. And if we take the communication of science as a responsibility of not only journalists, but also scientists, different roles, but of course, nowadays with social media, scientists are more and more often communicating science directly. So what do you think that we are doing well as a community? And what can we do better in your perspective in order to properly communicate science to make it accessible and also compelling in a way?
Yeah, so I think particularly for me, because a lot of my research is publicly funded, I think I have an obligation towards the society to also communicate all of the results. I think scientists very often now realize that they will need to do this, but communication and journalism is a job. It's a skill. And as a scientist, we're not necessarily trained as communicators. And I think there also, I think we can really learn from each other and work together with communication specialists more to increase how effective we are actually in our communication.
Fantastic. I have a few other questions that I want to ask, and one of them I think it's very important. And after that, I'm going to start reading some questions from the chat. So this is a very good moment for our audience to pose their questions here. Meta, you are a young woman in usually a very male environment. Do you have that sense that you faced obstacles that were not there for peers that are men or stuff like that? How do you personally see the value of an award like this being a young woman? And also a follow-up question to this one, how do you balance your, I mean, that's a very general question, but I think that it has to be asked. How do you balance your personal life with such a time-consuming job that you have?
Yeah, so I think that question in itself is an example of, I think, how men and women are very often treated differently, because that question is actually the most often asked question to me. I have 2 children, and I'm very lucky because I have a wonderful husband who actually takes care of the children, laundry, cooks. He does everything, and he supported me throughout my life. And so I wouldn't be here without him, but I am quite sure that for most men, the same holds true, but then in reverse, they will have a wife back home who managed, supported them and managed a lot of things back home. And it's interesting how we take that for granted, but if it's a woman, we always ask. And that in a sense is also a bit of a judgment towards men. So men can really do the household, take care of children very well. I can tell you I have a wonderful husband and they can be extremely good at it. So I think that's also something that we tend not to believe, but they can just as well as women. So I think that is one of the, the things that I notice. And of course, yes, it's sometimes harder for a woman to achieve certain things. It's sometimes harder for a woman to be heard or to make yourself heard. I have to say, I tend to just work harder and fight harder. And I think this prize is, I often notice that, winning a prize, I never realized this myself, but if I win this prize, if I tell this to my team, for example, it's particularly the women who will congratulate me and feel that it is a major achievement, not just for me, but for women as a whole, and they're extremely proud of the female community that I am, able to actually achieve these things. So I think a lot of them will see me as an example of how it really doesn't matter whether you're, male or female. My team is very mixed. I have people of all kinds of types, colors, beliefs. For me, that really is irrelevant.
Fantastic. I think that's very important, especially for women in countries like Brazil and others where sexism is much more present now and during, on day-to-day life. But this is, you are very lucky. I'm happy to hear about it. Moving on to some questions in the chat. Hakon is asking, from time to time, we see headlines in the newspapers that go something like this: we are close to a cure for malaria. How far are we away from reading the word of malaria? How really far are we?
I think that's a very hard question because basically, as you know, science is unpredictable. I think, I think it was Albert Einstein who said, if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't be calling it research. So the outcome of your experiment is unknown. That makes a certain uncertainty about when you will reach the end goal. And I once had a professor who told me that malaria eradication is like running a contest, like a marathon or something, but not knowing how far you will have to run. So it's a matter of keeping on running and keeping on going and believing that at some point you reach the finish line. You just don't know how far ahead it will be. And of course, we know sometimes, we can see things progress. We recently had the news of R21, the malaria vaccine with more than 70% efficacy in trials in Burkina Faso, which obviously is great progress. And then we know that we were a step closer to that finish line, but obviously 70% still not 100. But, at least we've got the first 70. And so I think we still need to invest. There's still steps to go. But at some point, we will get to that finish line. And I think it should be feasible to eradicate malaria. I think more feasible is to say, how can we control malaria so that the number of deaths are close to none? And then let's see if we can get to eradication ultimately.
That's very good news. A couple of questions here about the use of gene drives to deal with malaria in research. I also want to ask you like a kind of directly connected question to this one. The ethical boundaries in research when we are dealing with infectious diseases like the ones you deal with. You yourself have worked in a very popular research that you could tell us about all the steps that you faced in order to get it approved and how effective it was. I mean, it was such a journey as I can imagine. So I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so the studies we do very often involve the experimental or on-purpose infection of healthy individuals. And then we experiment on healthy individuals that live in, the Netherlands or sometimes US, UK. And these are people that are not naturally exposed to malaria or schistosomiasis, hookworm. And we expose them to these pathogens. And obviously we keep them very close. We watch them very carefully, and we will provide curative treatment. So we will cure them at the end of the experiment. But it really begs the question of, is it justified to expose these people to a certain risk? Because they always will be. There will always be some residual risk in any clinical study with healthy people. Is it justified to do that based on a bigger scientific value, social value for a community that they might not be directly part of because they're not necessarily living in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Amazon region. And this is obviously an interesting dilemma, and I think even ethicists haven't fully agreed on the absolute answer to this. And for every study, we'll have to balance this again. And that also goes for me personally. For every study, I will have to really think about it and balance it for myself again as well, and justify it for myself, because it does give me sleepless nights sometimes. And I question myself whether it's justified. And obviously the justification lies in the expected scientific value. How much do we think we can learn? And I think there, my sense of a global community is really very important. I feel that I personally have a responsibility to people living in sub-Saharan Africa, even though they're far away, because they are members of that same community. And if you feel that way, then it really, then for me, it's justified to have a very small or a little risk to people, part of that same community living here, to ultimately make sure that we save lives there. For me, that location doesn't really matter anymore, because I feel, I'm very much a globalist. So I feel we're part of this global community. But I can also understand that people will view this differently. And this also has to do with the sense of, who's to blame. If something goes wrong in one of the studies, I'm to blame. I've inflicted something to another person. And I'm a physician, and I vowed to always do what's good for my patient. And now I'm purposely inflicting something on somebody else. So, do you feel happy with that? Do you feel that that's justified? For me, yes, I do feel it's justified. I also feel that I can only do that if the people I work with, so the volunteers that I work with, understand very well what exactly the experiment's about, what exactly the risk is about, and they agree and are happy to do so, and are motivated to do so. We've actually looked into the motivation of people doing that, because a lot of people ask me, who would do that? And you can see that a lot of them are driven by altruistic ideas of wanting to do something for science, wanting to do something for that global community or for people elsewhere, feeling, wanting to contribute something. And I think that's really important to these people.
Well, thank you very much. There's a question coming from Moni. Speaking about that global community, how the local people are trying to fight against malaria. That might have different replies depending on the location, right? But if you want to share that with us.
Yeah, so I think the tools that we have right now are very much based on mosquito control. So this can be insecticide-treated bed nets or spraying, indoor residual spraying of houses. So it's mosquito control as well as track and trace. So finding cases of malaria, doing proper diagnosis and treating them with antimalarials, making antimalarials available throughout the world. Actually, bed nets are a very cheap and efficient way to gain malaria control. There's still areas in the world where we're not doing that well, and we can still distribute more bed nets. Obviously, they don't last forever, so it's something that will need to require, ongoing efforts. And we're facing challenges with regards to insecticide resistance. So mosquitoes are getting resistant to insecticides. We know parasites are getting resistant to medication. So I'm actually very worried. You see the global cases of malaria stalling. So the numbers are now staying the same. They used to decrease every year, and now they're staying the same. And that's really worrying to me because it makes me realize that there's still ongoing transmission. And as soon as control decreases, you will have a flare-up of cases. And I think we don't realize this. So like the COVID crisis, if you have a flare-up, things go exponentially. The human brain is not made to understand exponential curves, but in infectious diseases, very often increases go exponentially. And I think we have to be warned that if you lose control, we can really get an exponential increase of malaria cases in certain areas. And we've seen that happening particularly in areas where there's political instability. So where control programs are ineffective. And that's worrying to me, and it means that we need more control tools, which means we need vaccines, but also new drugs, new inventive ways of insecticides, maybe sterile mosquitoes. These are interesting ideas. And I think it's very, you need a comprehensive approach. So this is not a problem that we will be solving with just a vaccine. It's something that we need to really put effort into multiple tools and integrating those, putting them together, and then rolling that out across sub-Saharan Africa.
Fantastic. You've mentioned the political scenario as a reason for the worsening of diseases like malaria. Do you think the COVID-19 situation as well has a direct relationship with that? Right.
Yeah. So the COVID-19 situation can really impact malaria cases, and I don't have a full view now of how things are in different areas in Africa. When I speak to my colleagues, it's up and down, like it's with us. But sometimes they have bad times and lockdowns, and I think it will take us a while to get an overview of the full impact of the pandemic. But I'm extremely worried, obviously, that it will have impacted malaria diagnosis, control, and that it will lead to flare-ups, at least in certain areas. Yeah.
Thank you. I have to apologize that eventually I'm looking down or looking at the chat and not always directly looking at you, but I know you understand. One important aspect of your work is this, and I'm very curious about this, and you've mentioned superficially today, this network of researchers in different countries. This is such a great achievement, and I think that brings a lot of positive side effects for these countries that are involved. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? So how does that work? Do you share databases, and also do you chase funding together? How does that work? And how hard was to put that into place?
Yeah, so we do chase funding together. I think I'm always a bit embarrassed actually working on malaria and schistosomiasis in the Netherlands. I think it's really inappropriate. It shouldn't be me, it should be somebody else looking much different, working on these type of diseases. But I also know that, you know, the facilities that we have here at the LUMC are really not comparable to the facilities that are often available in sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you want to put in the same effort into malaria as we're doing with COVID-19, we'll have to put all the facilities to use for these diseases as well. So what I try to do is, if there's, you know, if we need to do a complex study or a complex idea, to try it out here, set it up, and then as soon as something works, find partners that I think are capable of taking it forward, and then working with them together. And sometimes it's the reverse, which I think is great. So my, you know, African researchers will ask me whether I'd be happy to, you know, participate or help them out with something, or and of course, you know, I'm always happy and glad to do so. The COVID-19 crisis made it a bit hard, I have to say, to collaborate. Internet connections are not always stable, so digital connections are harder. And so for the Letten Prize, we're hoping to make a film of the research that we do, which I'm hoping will really help to, without having to fly across the world, still convey what we're doing here, and you know, how we're doing this, so that we can actually educate researchers elsewhere. And you know, my biggest dream is that I'm out of a job, that there'll be so many researchers in sub-Saharan Africa doing what I do, that really I'm not needed anymore. I'm redundant. That'd be great.
Yeah, cooperation is really the path, and I think they are grateful for your efforts in that sense, in that regard. There is another question from Hakun here. The effective altruism movement, which I honestly don't know, I'm being honest here, in trying to save as many lives as possible in the most cost-effective way possible, moves a lot of resources to things such as bed nets. Should they instead fund malaria vaccine research, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think, so my answer to that is always, you can't, I was just explaining, you can't fight malaria with bed nets alone. You can't fight malaria with vaccines alone. So within the malaria community, within the community of people working in infectious diseases in tropical areas, we shouldn't be fighting each other. We shouldn't be competing for the same funds. The funds should come elsewhere, because the total amount of fund is just too little. So instead of all competing for either bed nets or vaccines, it's not going to work. Ultimately, we will need much more investment in total. So actually, my answer to that question is a much different one. I think we should, as a global community, invest much more in research into these important infectious diseases, despite the fact that they occur in poor areas. And ultimately, that will have an economic benefit for people in countries there, but also have an economic benefit for the world. So ultimately, it will be a good investment. It's just really long-term thinking, thinking about next generations. And we need to be bold enough to do so.
Yeah, the legacy, right? That's very important. We are moving towards the end of our session, and I want to again offer you the floor so you can say a few words before we wrap it up. But also, before you do this, I have a question that I like to often ask different researchers from different fields, because they bring different perspectives. So if you had to explain to a person who is not familiar with science, why can we trust science? How would you explain this to this person? Why? Because I think the question is posed in a very bad way on social media, but I think it is a valid question, and it is kind of our job to make that answer very clear.
Yeah. So I think the COVID-19 crisis is making it very easy for us now to answer that question. So we are wearing masks because science discovered that that's the way to prevent transmission. We're cleaning our hands because we have, scientists discovered that that's the way to transmit. We're having vaccines thanks to, bold scientists, paving the way already for decades ago. So I think we have a lot of things that we take for granted that actually science or scientists were responsible for. And I think we all understand that if we hadn't known that, that would have been a disaster. Yeah. So maybe as a final words or I think my final words will go to a thank you to the Letten Prize Committee members who I got to chat with or talk to during my interview, which was extremely inspiring. Young people from all around the world. And again, they've really also inspired me to continue doing what I do and reaching out and realizing that there's so much common ground we have that we really should take as a tool to advance science. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Meta. Inspiring words. And does anyone have like a final question? We have room for only one question, or can we move on to closing the session? All right. So I just want to thank you again for this opportunity to be here with Meta. I've learned so much, Meta. I mean, if this was a regular journalistic interview, we would have so much headlines here. And that means that you speak very well, you make things very clear to the audience, and you are very passionate about your work. And so it's not enough to say congrats again for the Letten Prize. And as we mentioned before, this conversation was hosted by the Letten Foundation, the Young Academy of Norway, with the support of the World Federation of Science Journalists. Feel free to reach us out, and also be aware that we have the Letten Prize has two runners up to this prize: Dr. Tallulah Oni, an urban epidemiologist at University of Cambridge, and Dr. Ramona Viejarasa. I'm sorry, Ramona, if I'm misspoken your name, at the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology, Sydney. Both of them will be present in the upcoming weeks to speak with us. Next week, we will have Dr. Tallulah, and in the week after that, Ramona will be here. And we are all very eager to hear from them, because they also have amazing developments in their work. And so this is it. Thank you very much all for being here, and a round of applause for Meta, because you can turn on your mics now. I think this is a good opportunity. So
thank you.
Kudos to you, and thank you for the Letten Foundation for organizing this event.